Hello there, true crime lovers. Thank you for tuning in to episode 9 of Always Time for True Crime. I'm your host, Julia. If you guys are super bored during this quarantine, then I have got a treat for you, because the man I'm covering today is even crazier than this quarantine. Today, I'm going to be telling you the story about Peckish Pete, a cannibalistic serial killer who believed eating human flesh would make him more powerful, who one doctor referred to as the real Silence of the Lambs Hannibal, and most terrifyingly, who tricked some of the best psychiatrists and institutions in England into thinking he was sane enough to walk the streets. This is the story of Peter Bryan. Alright, let's dig into Peckish Pete, pun intended. Peter Bryan was born in London on October 4th, 1969. His parents were both Barbadian immigrants, and he was the youngest of 7 children. Peter and his family grew up in an area of East London called Forest Gate. This area has changed a lot since Peter's childhood. It's now a very up-and-coming neighborhood, but back when Peter was growing up, it was looked upon as more of a dingier neighborhood. The area received a lot of racism because it was mainly made up of Afro-Caribbean and Pakistani immigrants, and violence against these immigrants was not rare at this time. Many murders of immigrants were kind of swept under the rugs by police or simply referred to as gang activity, when it was really just innocent immigrants being attacked because of their ethnicity. Throughout the 70s and 80s, there were many protests in the area against the violence that immigrants endured. In fact, the first school strikes against racism and fascism in Britain took place in Forest Gate. So while I don't want to assume anything about Peter's childhood, it's very likely that he could have been subject to racism and violence at a young age, even if it was just indirectly. Around age 14 or 15, Peter got sick of going to school and dropped out to start working. He left home and was living in the Flying Angel Custom House. This building was originally used to house seamen when they were between missions, before opening as college dorms in 1973. It was then turned into flats a few years before Peter started living there. The flats were a little bit cheaper, as according to my understanding, they were more of like a hostel setup, so you got your own room and sink but would share a kitchen and a toilet. So in 1987, while living in these flats, 18-year-old Peter began showing signs of a violent nature. Police had reported to a disturbance at the Flying Angel Flats, where Peter had attempted to throw another resident out of a 6-story window. However, the other guy had fought back against him and gotten away, leaving Peter with a large gash on his head. The police looked into it and questioned Peter about his head injury, but after that, just kind of dropped the incident and moved on. And according to reports, this attack was entirely unprovoked. For the next while, Peter had a couple of minimum wage jobs, and in 1993 was working in a clothing store. But when he was caught stealing, and was fired, he didn't take the dismissal very well. Peter wanted revenge. He later told psychiatrists that the store owner had actually owed him money, and fired him so that he didn't have to pay him. But I think that's just Peter's version that he tells himself. On March 18th, 1993, Peter came back to the store high on marijuana. The store owner's daughter, 20-year-old Nisha Seth, was working at the store that night with her 12-year-old brother, Bobby. Peter came in the store and pretty much immediately knocked Bobby to the floor unconscious. He then turned his attention to Nisha, his intended victim. He hit her 6 times over the head with a claw hammer and took off before police arrived. By the time police had arrived at the scene, Nisha was already dead. 12-year-old Bobby later recovered in the hospital. According to Peter, the motive was to get revenge for being fired and for being owed money, though some had the idea that Peter was actually attracted to Nisha, and when he was fired, this was his way to take out his anger. Police were able to track Peter down later that night after he jumped off a 3-story flat building. apparently attempting suicide. Although he broke both ankles in landing, he survived and was admitted to the hospital. He later pleaded guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Diminished responsibility means that they did break the law, but they should not be held fully responsible because their mental function was impaired, which in turn reduces a murder offense to manslaughter. And just to be clear, the fact that he was high can maybe count towards the mental impairment, but that's not the sole cause. It has to be some kind of actual mental issue that impaired him. So because he pleaded guilty on grounds of diminished responsibility, the judge had the option to send Peter to a mental health facility instead of jail, for treatment rather than punishment. In 1994, Peter was sent to Rampton Secure Hospital, a high-security psychiatric hospital in Nottinghamshire, England. He remained there for about 7.5 years until early 2001, when nurses thought he was doing a lot better. They noted he had matured greatly and had made progress in his behavior, attitude, and how he handled anger. In 2002, he was moved to Riverside Hostel in London, where he was allowed to live as a community outpatient. So he still had meetings with psychiatrists and social workers, and probably had a curfew, but he was allowed to come and go with his keys. Nurses continued to say that Peter was doing much better and that he posed no major risk. They even lowered his medication dosage after he had complained that the dosage was unnecessarily high and that he didn't need it. It was later discovered that these social workers, who were assigned to care for Peter Bryan, had no experience dealing with mentally disordered offenders, had never worked with a murderer, and simply didn't have the proper training and knowledge on mental health. So when these social workers evaluated Peter Bryan, they didn't know what they were even looking for in their patient. But we'll see why that's important a little bit later. After he had been doing so well in the Riverside Hostel, Peter's social workers wanted to take the next step to move him into independent accommodation. But in early 2004, he was reportedly caught being inappropriate with a minor at the hostel. Reports say he gave a 16-year-old girl a raspberry on her stomach, which is basically when you just blow on someone's stomach with your lips against their skin. It's kind of hard to explain. I think most people are familiar with the term, but if not, you can go Google it and try to get a better understanding. Anyway, it's a pretty creepy thing for a grown man to do to a 16-year-old. So this caused him to be transferred for a short-term stay at the Newham General Hospital in the open psychiatric ward. He was actually transferred there for his own safety because after people had heard what had happened with him and this 16-year-old girl, he was getting a lot of threats from the others who lived at the hostel. Like I said, the psychiatric ward was an open one. Open wards are for the short-term stay only, and they're usually for patients who need short-term treatment, or for patients who are coming from long-term treatment and need help integrating back into normal life. In open wards, patients are not locked up, and they have freedom on a lot of things. It depends on the ward, of course, but doctors usually still hold on to the medication so that patients don't harm themselves, but it kind of allows them to start taking care of themselves again and get practice living in a community. So I think that was the plan for Peter Bryan. He had already come from the Riverside Hostel where he was allowed this kind of freedom, so I'm guessing this was kind of the same thing, like the final step before he could live on his own. According to reports, Peter settled into his new spot quickly and didn't show any symptoms of not wanting to be there and didn't lash out at any of the staff. So after 1 week of being there, on February 17th, 2004, Peter decided to leave the ward for the first time. He immediately went to a hardware shop and did some shopping that many would find a tad concerning. He bought a Stanley knife, a claw hammer, and a screwdriver, and then went to the flat of his friend, Brian Cherry. Peter had met Brian Cherry back when he was living at Riverside Hostel. When he was allowed to leave on his own, he engaged with drug dealers and prostitutes, and he had met Brian Cherry in this crowd. Cherry was described as a nice man, but he lived alone and didn't have many friends. That night, when Peter arrived at his friend Brian's house, he clubbed his friend to death with the claw hammer he had just bought. Then, just after 7 p.m., Nicola Newman, a friend of Cherry's, was supposed to meet up with him. She let herself into the apartment and was met with Peter Bryan standing bare-chested in the hallway, holding a knife and covered in blood. Nicola could see behind Peter that her friend was dead. His body was naked, lying on the carpet, with his arm clearly separated from the rest of his body. Then Peter told her, "You should go," to which I imagine she ran the hell out of there and then called police. When police arrived, Peter was sawing off the second leg from Cherry's body, after already having removed the 2 arms and the other leg. The scene was absolutely covered in blood. Really gruesome. But what officers found next would be even more disturbing. Mr. Cherry's skull had been smashed with the hammer at least 24 times, and the top of his head had been sawn off. Then, officers looked into the kitchen and noticed some meat cooking on a frying pan. The meat was Mr. Cherry's brain. Peter then turned to police and said, "I ate his brain with butter. It was really nice." Reports say Peter complied with everything the officers told him to do and was arrested without incident. While in custody the next day, a psychiatrist was sent in to evaluate Peter Bryan. Peter told the psychiatrist that he had originally gone to Cherry's house for a burglary, but then Cherry started calling him names and it infuriated him. Further into the same interview, he told the counselor he was comforted by the smell of blood. Not everyone's favorite smell, but okay, Peter. During the next 2 months, Peter was first sent to Pentonville Prison before soon after being transferred to Belmarsh. At both prisons, he was evaluated by many different psychiatrists. Some speculated that he may have killed Brian Cherry because he wanted to stay in a facility and was stressed about having to return to the community. It's also noted that during these interviews, Peter Bryan was cooperative, had good eye contact, normal speech, and articulation. But he was still deemed unpredictable at Belmarsh Prison. In March 2004, he assaulted a female member of staff. Then, 3 days later, he started a fire in his own cell. He even told one psychiatrist that he wanted to kill someone and eat their nose, which is oddly specific. And although Peter always denied he was mentally ill, one psychiatrist speculated that Peter was suffering from a paranoid schizophrenic illness. So after this, Peter was looking more dangerous than ever. On April 2nd, someone from Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric hospital, came to evaluate Peter and said he clearly needed to be in a higher security hospital. And when this man went to interview him, he called it a Silence of the Lambs interview because he actually had to sit outside the cell because it was deemed too dangerous to go into Peter Bryan's cell. This same psychiatrist from Broadmoor also agreed that Peter was schizophrenic. It was decided that Peter would be transferred to Broadmoor Hospital. And how do I explain Broadmoor? Broadmoor Hospital is something out of American Horror Story. It opened in 1863, so it's super old, and it kind of looks like this haunted castle with high brick walls surrounding the property. When it opened, it was actually called Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. How freaky does that sound? It has housed some of England's most notorious prisoners. Arguably, most notably, Peter Sutcliffe, aka the Yorkshire Ripper. So Peter Bryan finally gets to Broadmoor on April 15th, 2004, and he's super aggressive to the nurses and is just lashing out at everyone. So for the first 4 days, he's kept in a cell and not allowed to interact with anyone else. But after those 4 days, the workers are like, yeah, he's settling in nicely and we can put him in the medium risk ward where he can hang out with other prisoners. They said they thought the seclusion had changed his behavior and the staff were not particularly concerned about the risk he posed towards them, even though he had a history of attacking staff members. The next few days, nurses reported that Peter was doing well. He played table tennis with the staff, he hung out with other prisoners, he took part in a volleyball game. He was having a good week. But on April 25th, 10 days after he arrived at Broadmoor, and only 6 days after being let out of isolation, Peter had what he called, quote, another violent urge. Peter had his eye on a fellow patient, 60-year-old Richard Loudwell. Richard was one of the 19 patients in the Luton ward, along with Peter Bryan. He was in Broadmoor for killing and sexually assaulting Joan Smythe in 2002, an 83-year-old woman living on her own. Loudwell was often bullied and harassed by the others, and both physically and verbally abused. He had even complained to social workers about it, but they didn't really do anything. On April 25th, just after 6 p.m., Peter Bryan attacked Richard Loudwell. The two were in the dining room, where social workers didn't have eyes on them, and apparently none of the 9 staff that were on duty knew the two were in there, even though they were supposed to check on their patients every 15 minutes. Peter Bryan snuck up behind Loudwell and strangled him with the string from his sweatpants. When that wasn't going as quickly as planned, Peter began smashing Richard's head against the floor, table, and wall until he stopped moving. Peter then went to go wash his hands and chill out in his room for a bit, but he planned to return to the body in a few minutes. This is when the social workers went to go investigate what all the commotion was, and saw Richard on the floor covered in blood, but still clinging to life. When social workers found Peter, he still had blood on his hands and shoes. Guess he didn't know the COVID method for washing your hands for 30 seconds. Once he was caught, he confessed what he had done to Loudwell. Richard Loudwell was immediately rushed to the hospital, but having never regained consciousness, died about a month later on June 5th. Peter told a psychiatrist the day after the assault that he had been planning the attack for several days and wanted to kill Loudwell because he was, quote, at the bottom of the food chain. He also said he not only wanted to kill Richard, but that he also wanted to eat him. If he had had more time, he would have, quote, cooked him and eaten him. He even stated that cannibalism was normal because it had been around for centuries. It was a natural food source that made him stronger. He then expressed that he wanted to kill 8 people because he wanted to be known as a serial killer. But you only need to kill 3 people to be a serial killer, so I don't know why he specifically needed 8, but okay, clearly he's not a logical guy. After these interviews, psychiatrists deemed Bryan the most dangerous man they had ever assessed due to his ability to present himself as entirely calm and settled. After the attack on Loudwell, the British National Health Service came under a lot of scrutiny for not assessing Peter Bryan correctly and therefore not having him in a more secure setting. The parents of his first victim, Nisha Shesh, were particularly upset that a man who beat their daughter to death had the opportunity to kill others because authorities didn't deem him a large risk. On March 15, 2005, Peter Bryan pleaded guilty to both Brian Sherry and Richard Loudwell's deaths, again on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The judge said in order to protect the public, Peter should be put away for life. He was given a whole life sentence, which means he would basically never get out and was sent back to Broadmoor to live in high-security, high-risk wards. Since Peter Bryan has gone back to Broadmoor in a higher security setting, a new management team and board has been put in place, and they've increased the number of staff on duty. The parents of Nisha, however, said Peter's life sentence meant nothing to them, as they believe Peter will again be able to manipulate nurses and psychiatrists into thinking he's sane, just like he did before. And they were partially right. In 2006, his whole life sentence was overturned because the Court of Appeal argued the judges had failed to adequately reflect on Peter Bryan's mental illness. He was then told he could have the chance for parole after 15 years, though the judges still believe he won't ever get out. The sad thing, and the kind of infuriating thing is that if Peter had been arrested right after Nisha's murder, these other two murders could have been prevented. I mean, he clawed her to death with a hammer and somehow got out after 7.5 years of serving in a mental health facility. I think if the nurses had maybe been a bit more qualified or just paid attention more, they could have understood that this guy was a big risk and was going to kill again. And while I know that the NHS took a lot of responsibility for what Bryan did, I also think it shows how manipulative this guy is, because he really tricked everyone into thinking that he was sane and calm and was never gonna pose a risk to anyone else. Peter Bryan still currently resides at Broadmoor Hospital and recently celebrated his 50th birthday in October 2019. Since he was sentenced in 2005 and only has to serve a mandatory of 15 years before he's eligible for parole, I imagine that he's going to be allowed to apply for parole sometime in 2020. So I will try to keep you guys posted if anything happens with that, but so far, in the first 3 months of 2020, nothing has happened with it. Honestly, 2020 has been such a shit show that I would not even be surprised if they released a cannibal out into the street. But for the sake of his victims' families, I hope the judges are able to make the right decision. So that's all I have on the story of Peter Bryan. Again, thank you guys for tuning in for episode 9. I'm going to have something really cool out for episode 10. It's going to be a really awesome case that, again, a lot of you probably haven't heard of. I mean, I try to do that for every episode, so let's hope that's the case for episode 10. Please go leave me a 5-star review somewhere. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, even Facebook would be great. And then again, please go follow me on all of my social media channels, such as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And you can find me there at Always Time for True Crime. Thanks, guys. See you later.